So what we heard today, the charge, the understanding. When I tell you, Tim, I was so fired up, I was down and I was about, teach! You got to teach us. Teach us what we need to know. Teach us what we need to hear. And more so over as we had dinner last night with you and understanding what we are in the state of Seattle colleges, but then even in the city of Seattle. Tell us more. Talk to us as we think about how we move. And we talked about, of course, our wonderful liberals, and we talked about, but let me be clear. I'm going to dive right into it because you know what we do when we have these conversations, because it's not only just the white liberals. Let's talk about the people of color who also have to be held accountable as well. Okay? So what do we do when, it's a quote that says, to be wounded in a house of a friend? What happens then? So we all have work to do, and I thank you all for being here to make sure that we do the work. But Tim, as you all gather and get ready for your questions, the first question I'm going to really just put out there is, where do we go now? Where do we go now?
Well, first off, thank you all so much for sticking around for this extended conversation. I regret that this chair is so comfortable. I feel like I want to take the chair and the step. The box I'm going to take and this chair I'm going to take. I don't know how I'm going to get it on the airplane, but I really want this chair. This is very comfy. So I'm going to try to maintain my level of energy, even though it's draining from me, as you can tell. I think where we go is a little bit back. And what I mean by that is, again, going back to my earlier remarks, we think of this monster as new. And if you think of the monster as new, or you think of this as a moment that's unprecedented, you scramble for answers because you're like, what the hell do I do? I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I had this superpower, and it wasn't like a cool one. Like I couldn't see through walls or, fly, leap tall buildings in a single bound, that kind of stuff. But I could get out of nightmares. Right? I knew how to get out of nightmares. So if I was having a nightmare, I knew that I could blink my eyes really hard and I would be safe from whatever monster was chasing me, whatever person with a knife. Clearly, I was a disturbed child. Somebody was always chasing me, but I was ready for him. And the only time it didn't work was if the monster was new, because I'd never seen that monster before, so I didn't know how to get away. I'd have to hide. But once I got to where I knew the monster, and I knew the monster couldn't get me because he didn't get me last time, right? Then I'd be able to get out of the dream. I think the same sort of thing applies here. If you understand that the monster under the bed, so to speak, or the monster in the closet that we face is the same one, then you can learn from what others have done in the face of that monster, and maybe you yourself have done, right? I mean, this might be a ramped up version of that monster. Yeah. This might be that monster on steroids, or that monster, that monster's a lot more insatiable maybe than it was last time you saw it, but it's fundamentally the same thing. And so if you learn that history of how did folks resist, how have you resisted before? What lessons did you learn from your prior resistance? What lessons can you take away from the civil rights struggle, from the labor struggle, from the women's rights struggle, from the LGBTQ liberation struggle, from the abolition struggle? Because whatever you think we're facing right now, as serious as that is, I think it's obvious, or ought to be, that the odds are no worse than they were for the people who were fighting the system of enslavement. They're not any worse than the odds of people that were fighting Jim Crow. They're not any, they can't be any worse than the odds facing Bull Connor. Right? I just don't believe, y'all, that somehow black and brown folks who could not be stopped by the likes of George Wallace and Bull Connor and Orville Faubus in Arkansas and Thomas Jefferson, for God's sake, are going to be stopped by Donald John Trump. I just don't believe that. I don't fundamentally believe that these folks know some stuff that those folks didn't, or that they're just that smart, right? Or that they're that capable. So I just think you go back and you spend some time reading those civil rights biographies, reading those abolitionist narratives, reading about folks who faced odds that were at least as bad as the ones we're facing and maintained their commitment and made a difference in spite of all of that. And I think if you do that, you can take heart from those lessons and you won't feel as alone, you won't feel as uncertain, you won't feel as insecure.
Well, thank you. First question. Mike is coming to you.
Greetings, Mr. Wise. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
So I have a question. You made a statement that the pain and the sickness of Black folks and other BIPOC communities of color then become the pain and the sickness of white folk. But I'm right now in a fellowship with Dante King and Robin DiAngelo around diagnosing whiteness and their anti-Blackness. And what I would take, my takeaway from attending that fellowship is that the sickness of white folks is what has caused so many of us to become sick.
For sure.
So instead of us having to diagnose their sickness, how do we get them to diagnose themselves so they can stop making the rest of us sick?
Yeah. And make no mistake, I agree fully with that, the etiology of the sickness that you have just laid out, the directionality of it and its origin, right? The system of white supremacy, the system of colonialism, the system of oppression is what creates the dysfunctions, the dislocations, and the sicknesses and illnesses, personal and collective, that plague communities of color, no doubt. My point in bringing up what I brought up was it's a principle from critical race theory that I think is important for us to lift up in this moment, especially as critical race theory is under attack from people that don't understand it and have an interest in distorting it, right? And that lesson that Derek Bell and others, Kimberly Crenshaw and others, have developed within critical race theory is this notion that every time there was ever progress, if there was progress, it only happened in those cases and in those instances when the interest of Black folks in particular dovetail with the interest of white folks. In other words, what Bell was saying was don't expect white folks to do this for the right reasons, right? Don't expect white folks to just suddenly decide, you know what, that white supremacy thing has been really awful and we should get rid of it, right? That probably is not gonna happen. And Derek Bell, as a Black man, was saying, I'm not waiting for that. I can't wait for that. And I don't know too many Black and brown folks, and I don't know too many white anti-racists that want to wait around for that. I've been white a long time. I'm not going to wait for my people to just wake up. And it's just like with men in patriarchy. I don't expect men to just wake up and all of a sudden go like, man, this thing has been really wrong, what we've been doing. We should probably get rid of it. I think there might be some who feel that way, but for most, I think, and especially in a society that pushes the notion of self-interest so much, that we have to show the connection between equity and justice for Black and brown peoples and the way that actually does pay dividends for everybody. But that doesn't mean that we don't identify the source of the problem. The source of the problem is white supremacy. White supremacy then eats itself, right? White supremacy lays the seeds of Black and brown folks' destruction, but ultimately lays the seeds of white folks' destruction, because it's white supremacy that promulgated that war on drugs. It's white supremacy that promulgated a system the denial of COVID when it was disproportionately hurting Black and brown people. It was white supremacy that didn't care when manufacturing jobs began leaving urban areas in the 80s, long before they started leaving some of these white communities. And so if we understand that white supremacy, and by the way, there's one I didn't mention, you know, we're talking a lot about healthcare right now because folks are getting shot, right? And all of a sudden, folks are like, oh, maybe our healthcare system is broken. Yeah, been broken for a long time. But you know, one of the reasons it's broken, and this doesn't get talked about, but we should talk about it, is because we have a mentality in this, and there's actually been research on this, that the number one reason that we don't have universal, guaranteed healthcare in this country for everyone, in a kind of single payer model like every other industrialized nation that we like to compare ourselves to, the only reason, not the only one, but the main reason, according to the research, is that disproportionately white folks say that if we have that, Black people will cheat the system and take advantage of the system. Now think about the irony of that. You got millions of white folks that need a better healthcare system. Millions of white people that need a more affordable, guaranteed, universal healthcare system, but they are literally willing to die just to make sure somebody else doesn't get over on them, right? We would, even if you really thought people were going to cheat the system, even if you really believe that, do you want good healthcare or not? Well, I'll just die. That's pathological. And so it's a pathology that first and foremost destroys black and brown people, but then the residual, the collateral damage, if you will, that's a term we often use in a really disgusting way, right? But this is actually an example of collateral damage. White folks are the collateral damage of our own system. And so that's what I was trying to stress. But make no mistake, the system created that dynamic. It wasn't something that begins in black space and then spreads. It goes from the white space to the black and brown space and then comes back again, right? Like a feedback loop, right? That's what I was meaning.
Thank you. More questions from the community. Let's dive deeper.
It's nice to meet y'all this afternoon. Appreciate y'all giving us y'all time and energy. I heard some great points, great topics. It's also great to hear a different perspective. So I appreciate that. But my generation, younger generation, we tend to fall through the cracks of just the vocabulary and grammar that we use. And I feel like that's very important. I just had my first child. And so I don't kind of want to teach her the ways of colored people or white people, whatever the case. Like, to me, I feel the same way you feel. We all the same. So I don't really see a color. I see the character that you exuberate with your energy. So what can we do to teach our younger crowd, like, the importance of the situation, the history in it, but how to break away from that and create our own path versus continuing to fight a fight that we know, like you said, we're not waiting on that, but how can we start living our own life and begin to space away from that just by how we communicate with each other?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'll say thank you, brother, for being authentically you and speaking for a generation that we need to be prepared to learn from, but also teach. Let me say this. It is important to always know your history. Never forget it. Because what will happen if you don't recognize your history and don't learn your history, history then will repeat itself. What you're trying to run away from will be right in front of your face and you won't know how to deal with it. Yeah. So I encourage you, and the generation that you come from, you are correct. At some point, we have to start moving past the conversations of this division and how do we come together. And that's what we must understand as the elders in the room and as the people that sit up here, is that is a bright hope for us, that we have a generation who is saying, we're tired of division. That's the cry I heard, more so than everything. So I say I commend you for that, but I want you to be careful and tread lightly as you bring your young person into this world. Never forget what your ancestors, what your mother, grandmother, granny, whatever you call, don't forget them, okay? Bless you, brother.
Yeah. And I would just add, I agree with all of that. I would just add that, when we're talking about social dynamics and systems, what we want and what we desire for our own children or for our own community, our own family, is only one very small part of the picture, because systems have a way of dealing with you whether you deal with them or not. And so it's like, sometimes you'll hear people, and I hear it from younger folks. I got two, young adult children, and they hear it from a lot of their peers, that their peers just like, I don't care. I don't follow politics. I don't care, but it's all corrupt. And it's all, here's the thing. You don't have to follow politics. You don't have to pay attention, but politicians are paying attention to you. And they will find ways to do what they want to do, whether or not we're paying attention, right? So echoing what you're saying, it's just a question of saying, yeah, you want to make sure that your children know that they are not defined by what other people say they are. That's very important, not to limit themselves to a conception of themselves which comes from somebody else, right? And make sure that they know there will be folks who will try to do that, right? It's like with our children, they're both girls, now young women. And, growing up, there's that part of me that wanted to tell them,
as I think most parents want to tell their kids, you can be anything you want to be. Just work hard, have a commitment, good vision of where you want to go, you can make it. Because that's like the American thing, right? That's just something, that's our like secular gospel. That's like Genesis 1:1 in the Bible of America, right? You just work hard, everything will be fine. But I had an obligation as a father to those girls and now young women to make sure that even though we told them that, sure we did, but we also put a little asterisk at the end of that promise, right? And that little asterisk, like when you're reading a contract and there's a little asterisk and it's like, oh, you better look at what's on the fine print, right? You got to come down and look at what's on the fine print. And the fine print asterisk says, in order for that thing that dad just told you to be true, you're going to have to understand a couple things. One is that there will be men and sadly some women who will undermine you on the path to your whatever it is, right? There will be people who will stand in the way because of this thing called sexism, because of this thing called patriarchy, misogyny, whichever term we choose to use. That doesn't mean you can't overcome that. But if you don't know it's there, because I didn't warn you about it, because I just wanted you to follow your bliss and be everything you could be, then I'm setting you up, right? It would be like sending my kids down an alley at night, and I know there's an electric fence at the end of the alley, but I'm like, well, I don't think I want to mention it because I don't want my kids to be neurotic and freaked out. No, I need to tell them so they can have a strategy for going around the fence, blowing up the fence, digging under the fence, whatever it is, right? So it's both of the thing. It's the thing that you mentioned, right? Which is not to be limited by the world's definitions. And it's also making sure that any child you have knows the world's definitions and knows how to fight them, right?
All right, more questions. Be mindful of the time. We have 15 more minutes. 15 more minutes. So get your questions ready. Come on, Eric, talk to us.
Okay, so just testing. Okay, so I just wanted to put out there one thing for you to consider because I hear you, and I feel like not only do I hear you, but I felt that when I was growing up in the 90s. During the 90s, like colorblindness was the topic du jour. That's what I grew up inside of, and I believed heartily that I was capable of it, and so did all of my peers. And those are the same peers today that now I don't see eye to eye with. So what I want you to consider is that I hear that you want to judge people by the merit of their skin, and I hear a lot of people today in today's political climate talking about how they want to live in a meritocracy, but there's double-blind studies showing that people act on unconscious bias, right? So like these two were just saying, we can want what we want, but we're still all swimming in the same fishbowl that we don't control how others act. So basically,
Thank
I think
you so much. Thought that was a question.
yeah, it wasn't. I apologize. But I guess all I'm saying is colorblindness didn't seem to yield the world we wanted it to. And I think that being aware of color, but trying to create a world as if colorblindness could exist is more important than being colorblind, maybe. That's not saying it's right. I'm just saying maybe.
And I'll say that's coming from someone who is about to have a child in May. So there we go. All right, next question.
Hello. My name is Regina King.
Come on, King.
My question for you is around, you spoke about identity and class, and it makes me think about culture. I'm in the bachelor's program working my community health and education degree. Yes.
One of our student leaders.
Yes, I'm gonna be a doctor one day, Dr. King. So I'm also culture, that's a culture, right? And I'm biracial, and I grew up in the 80s. And growing up, I am blending my identities. So during the week, I'm in white culture with trailers, and on the weekend, I'm in black culture at a church. And so growing up that way, and then in my 30s, now taking a lot of college classes, and education has been my culture and my family for a very long time, and I keep coming back to education. right? And as I'm choosing my classes, for example, US history, right? We're separating Black history from US history. And I'm wondering why to myself, right? And so I am having to choose between the two when for me it's the same. History is history. And so my question for you is, especially for the educators in the room, on topics where we often leave those out in grade school and high school and middle school, what are we doing now? And what do you think about now collectively as educators for our future to blend those? And do you have any advice for them?
Well, I think first, the reason that it has often been siloed is because the ignoring of Black history in good old-fashioned American history necessitated the creation of that discipline separate and apart. Now, that's perhaps unfortunate, shouldn't have happened that way. We should have understood that the Black experience was central to the American experience. And in fact, we can't understand the American experience without understanding the Black experience or the indigenous experience or the experiences of all peoples of color who are here and have been here from the beginning. But that was the origin of it. Now the question, so it wasn't just siloed out. It wasn't like white folks would have been happy to not have it taught at all, right? And it was Black folks who were like, no, we're going to have a month and we're going to have these classes and we're going to create this discipline. And now I think it's an open question about how do we not, it's just like with HBCUs. You don't have to get rid of HBCUs just because Black folks should have been allowed to go to white colleges all along. I mean, there's still a tradition, a culture, a history that is proud and amazing and should be maintained, even as a lot of Black students coming out of high school will apply to some historically white institutions and some HBCUs, and that's fine. Same can be the way we teach history. We can continue to have, and I think should have, Black history classes and departments, and we should insist that is not an excuse for teachers to downplay Blackness and other folks of color stories in the American history class because, it's being covered over there, or it's being covered in February, or whatever, right? There's a way to do that. And interestingly, if you research a little bit about the American Studies movement in the last 20 years, American Studies as a discipline, right, is its own department in a lot of colleges. And I took it in high school in the 80s. And back then it was still very Eurocentric. It was very white dominated in terms of the literature. It's basically a blending of literature and history, right? And it's taught, those are like taught together as a unit. And there's an AP course for it, and there's colleges that have entire departments on it. In the last 20 years, the American Studies discipline has aggressively moved in the direction of a multiracial, multicultural analysis, oftentimes centering the experiences of Black and brown peoples. It's been a pretty incredible transformation of that discipline. Now, it's gotten a lot of pushback from some people who are like, wait a minute, but that's an example of how you can, in fact, tell the American story through a different lens, right? You don't have to just parcel it out. So I would say maybe do a little research on look into that discipline, and because a lot of that is applicable to the K-12 experience. A lot of that is stuff that can be done not just in the formal class called American Studies, but it could be done in the English class where you're doing literature. It could be done in the American history class, just using that model though, using that kind of framework.
Right. Thank you. Any more questions? Shout out, Sophia. I see you back there. Hey. All right, brother, take one more question. Come on, we want to hear from you. Come on.
Just one more question. Kind of pinching off what you just talked about as far as not splitting things up. How important is it for us to understand our cultural history here as well as like our U.S. American history here? Like, I know I always like to ask my instructors when it comes to history about the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. And like that one gets overlooked, but my father and my uncle spent a lot of time talking to me about not just paying attention to who's being elected, but like what bills are coming up and being passed. How do you get voting in your local community and stuff like that? So what are some suggestions, again, that like the younger crowd can take to understand both of those histories and then use that to our advantage today?
Well, we have to have a whole new commitment to what they used to call civics, like back in the day, right? Which was like government, economics, policy making, history, all of it, because we have really downplayed that. And so we have people that are coming up now that, you know, if you get a good civics education where you understand how government works or how history has affected public policy, you're just lucky to have gotten that. Because what we've done is we've been so focused on STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering and math, that, and I'm not saying that's not important. Obviously, all that stuff is important. And as somebody that wasn't good at math or science, I'm glad some of y'all are. Like, that's important.
Thank you, Tina.
We need people to build bridges and do that stuff, right? But we also need to add, I've been talking about it for several years, something I call mesh education, right? Which is MESH, M for media literacy. So we get young people to know when they're being lied to in the media. I mean commercial media and social media, right? How do you discern truth from fiction? Just because you're seeing it online doesn't mean it's true. Now, interestingly, I think young people are actually better at this than us older folks. So maybe younger folks need to teach us, because it's a lot of older folks that are falling into these crazy rabbit holes on Facebook, believing something that their 73-year-old uncle heard from his nephew, and then it spreads around like a virus. But I think it's important we teach that early with young folks, like, how do you know when a source is legitimate versus when it's not? That's the M. The E is for ethics, right? So how do we make ethical decisions? Most of the time, you don't think about ethical dilemmas unless you're like going to study to be a minister, going to like theology school, becoming a theologian, or if you like are a philosophy student in college or something. But there are a lot of ethical dilemmas that we face every single day, right? That have public policy implications. How do we resolve those ethical dilemmas? We need to be talking to young people about that. The S in MESH is for sociology. What is sociology? It's the study of group dynamics and the interactions between groups, particularly around power imbalances, right? And so if you don't understand sociology, if you don't have a sociological imagination, and you won't get that just because you're alive, like that has to be provided to you. If you don't have a sociological imagination, you look around and you don't understand why the world is the way it is. You don't understand why there's racial inequality. Why is there so much economic inequality? Why do we not have this kind of healthcare versus that kind of healthcare? Why is gun violence such a problem? Like, you just see the problem, but you don't have the tools or the framework to understand it. So we need to be teaching that to kids. And then the H is history, right? Which is learning the real history, the hidden history, the stuff that hasn't been taught to us. And the good news about young folks, I think, is that if we start offering that, the thing about young people is that young folks know they're being lied to. Am I right? Like, young folks know that their parents lied to them, the society lies to them, because some of the lies are not a big deal. Some of the lies are like relatively minor things, tooth fairy, Santa stuff, like it's relatively minor. Some of the lies are really big though, right? And can be very dangerous if we don't prepare our children for the real world. So young people already know that we're not telling them the whole story. So I think if we were to go into schools and say, hey, let's talk about, we're going to teach history almost like a crime scene investigation, right? Like, let's look at the textbook and let's find out what's not in there. We're not just going to teach you what's in the textbook that the state said we had to use. We're going to find out what's not in there. Y'all go and research and find out, like, what are the other perspectives on this incident that we're talking about, or this period of time? And you'll find all kinds of things. And young people get on fire for that, because it's like they're detectives all of a sudden out looking at the crime scene, like, oh, I'm gonna understand what happened here, and everybody's lying to me, right? So you play upon that normal youthful enthusiasm for figuring out who's playing a trick on me, which all young people are like, my parents, they're all lying. That's right. Let's encourage them to go out and find truth, but also teach them how to discern truth. How do you figure out what is true and separate it from what's false? And I think we can do that around government and civics, around history, around all of those things that are part of MESH. And I think, ironically, if we did that, STEM education would be better too, because you really can't understand science. People that do science will tell you science is objective. We just follow where the science goes. But science has been used to marginalize people. Science has been used to eliminate people, right? Like, science was used to rationalize enslavement. Science was used to rationalize extermination. Science was used to justify sterilizing 100,000 women, mostly of color, in the 20th century so that they could not have children because there was a desire to prevent them from having children, right? Science was used for that. The idea was, well, if they have children, they'll pass along bad genes and low IQ and they're not intelligent and we don't want that was quote unquote science. Now it was nonsense. It was junk science, but scientists, I mean from Harvard, I mean from Stanford, I mean from Caltech, I mean from Yale, I mean University of Chicago, the best and the brightest were pushing that. So if I don't know that history though, I think science is objective and that I can get manipulated by people who say they're acting in the name of science, but I need to actually understand, well, what's your agenda? Do you have an agenda? Because we know that science can be misused, math can be misused, technology can be misused. We got artificial intelligence right now that's being used to identify quote unquote criminal suspects. And we come to find out it can't differentiate black faces. So what does that tell you, right? Garbage in, garbage out. Who programmed the AI? People.
That's right.
Right? People who have their own biases. So then they're like, well, I don't know. The AI is just as awful as the people that were identifying people before, because people are the ones who program it. So we can't just turn our lives over to technology, right? We got technology right now. If you're applying for a job, half the jobs, probably more than half the jobs, will just put your resume through an AI program looking for certain words, right? And then other words, it'll kick it out. So you won't even get an interview for a job, like unless you have certain words in the resume. Well, who knows which words to use and who doesn't?
Yeah.
Who do you figure is more likely to have someone who told them, hey, you need to have these words in there. These are the power words that you put in a resume, right? And the people that are more likely to know that are people who come from upper middle class and affluent families. That's going to be disproportionately white folks, right? So you're going to have working class people of all colors and disproportionately black and brown folks that don't even know the tricks. It's not because they're less qualified. They just don't know the trick when it comes to writing a resume, because the technology is just making decisions for human beings. So we acted like technology was going to liberate us from people's biases, but actually it's just baked in people's biases. So we have to understand that history if we're even going to do STEM well. Otherwise, we end up with a bunch of people that can code and nobody that knows how to maintain multiracial democracy, right? And that's not going to be helpful in the long run, you know?
Well, all right, you all. We're gonna take one more question, but before we get ready for this last question, I'm gonna do this. I know how people like to get up as soon as I say the last question, so pause on the question, hold on it, think about it, and let me make a few announcements. See how I'm gonna do this?
Yeah.
Gotta facilitate in a different way. We encourage you all, if you think that today's conversation with Tim was one that helped you learn, grow, and really push you, we encourage you to understand that we will have more conversations throughout the week coming up, which is our Social Justice Week, with many of our guest speakers who will have just as much to bring to the table. So if you don't have a flyer, get a flyer, pass them around, put them up in your offices, bring them up in your team meetings, bring them up in your classrooms, because this is just the beginning to kick off the week. So I encourage you all to do just that. I also want to make one quick note too as well, because we do have Tim. What I am going to do after the last question and answer is that everybody, if you are okay, would just come on up to the front, because I want to have one picture with Tim while we have him, and then we'll get him to the airport. So if you're okay with being up at the front up here with a picture, so photographer, we're going to ask you to come and you'll shoot it down that way instead of coming to the stage. That's how we'll do it. So we'll close out once again, if you don't mind coming to the front. After the question, we'll get Tim to come down, get a picture, and then we'll close out. Join us for our Social Justice Week coming up too as well. You got your question still? You remembered it?
Yes.
That's what I'm talking about. Talk to us.
Hi, my name is William Kim. I'm a first-year student at North Seattle.
Come on, first year. Yeah.
I want to start off by thanking Mr. Wise for that speech. It's been a while since I've seen like a really energetic presentation, so thank you for that. My question is about Dr. King, since today is the annual community celebration of Dr. King. And as we all know, Dr. King's legacy is one of nonviolence, but also in his counterpart, when I learned U.S. history, I also learned about Malcolm X and more of his ideology and approach to making change. And one string of narrative that I plucked out of during this election cycle was that the MAGA Republicans played it, they cheated, they didn't, or they broke the rules, while the liberals, more blue party, tried to or followed the rules, and they tried a nice approach, and I guess we could allude that to like nonviolence as well. And there was the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, which just added more ugliness to an already ugly chapter. And I don't want to quote myself into being a young person, but I know many young people want to see change, and I'm curious about what your thoughts are on young people who are more inclined to act directly, and I guess I'm assuming that includes violence, and people who are leaning more toward that. Do you think this is a time that maybe more direct action is needed, and if not, how we can try to make change without acting or relying on physical violence?
Right. Well, I think this. First off, I am not philosophically committed to pacifism. I also, though, know the country in which I live, and so I strategically am committed to nonviolence only because I know that attempting to fight this system, especially right now, with violence will result in the slaughter of everybody who tries it, and they'll say amen while they're doing it, right? There might have been a time in our history when the people at the top of the system would respond to some kind of more violent, more aggressive posture, This is not that time. This is a time when they are already talking about the Insurrection Act and rolling tanks down the street and shooting protesters who are engaged in nonviolence. They're already saying that. Donald Trump wanted to do that in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter uprising. He wanted and had a defense secretary who wouldn't go along with it, and had generals that wouldn't have gone along with it, but that was then, this is now. He said he wanted to turn police and military troops loose in the streets of this country, the latter of which is not legally allowed unless he invokes the Insurrection Act, which he's promising to do. If he's promising to do that with nonviolent demonstrators, you don't want to know what will happen if we think that we can somehow engage in violence and overthrow this state or this regime or change it. However that might have worked at some point, it is not going to work right now. So just strategically, whether people in this room are philosophically committed to nonviolence or just strategically, you just got to know, what the other side has planned and what they're capable of. Now, that means that we have to adopt nonviolence for largely the reason that Dr. King believed in it. I'm not saying that he didn't believe in it philosophically. He was morally committed to it. But he also understood that strategically the system was too entrenched and to have been brought down by a movement that engaged violently. He understood America better than most people did. And he also understood that he had to go into places like Birmingham to get beaten. Like Dr. King understood when they went to Birmingham that those water cannons were going to get turned on children. Mm-hmm. He knew that, and he did it anyway. Because what had just happened the year before is they had gone to Albany, Georgia to try to do sit-ins and try to do nonviolent, peaceful demonstrations in the hopes that they'd all get thrown in jail and it would be a mass outrage, but the police treated them relatively gently, put them in jail. There weren't really a lot of photo ops. And that was after that when they sat down, they said, we can't go to a place like Albany. It's not vicious enough. We got to go to Birmingham where they will beat us and maybe try to kill us. But then we will show the world who the bad guys are. And right now, with the media environment that we have, the ability to engage in anything even remotely looking like violence will allow the other side to paint the entire movement as that. They tried that in 2020. Right? Because a handful of folks, really statistically, a handful of people engaged in the burning of buildings. And by the way, they were often unaffiliated with the marchers. There's all kinds of videos you can see online of people who were BLM organizers who were yelling at the knuckleheads who have glommed onto that movement trying to burn down the auto zone in Minneapolis, that wasn't a BLM person. That was somebody that came in, white, by the way, right? And decided that that was what anarchy looks like. I'm just going to burn a building. Y'all know a little bit about that here in Seattle, right? Folks who think that their radicalism is like it's the difference, y'all, between Les Miserables and the French Revolution and Les Mis, the play, the musical, right? One is a performance. One was a revolution. One is performance. And there are a lot of folks that are into performance, right? So I'm going to throw a rock at a cop because F the police. Or I'm going to have a sign, you know, that's like the most radical, like, FU sign at the rally because F the police and F respectability politics. And, you know, and it's like, okay, cool. Let's see how that works. That is performance. That is not revolution. That is not radical. And it actually ends up causing people to believe that the entire movement is represented by those statistical handful of people. So I'm not saying, and I'm not saying by that we can't be aggressive. I'm not saying we can't be loud. Y'all heard my speech. I mean, you know, I'm not all warm and fuzzy. But there's a way to engage in the kind of movement building that we need to build. And I just think history tells us, and this moment tells us, that this system is not going to hesitate to slaughter people if there's even especially if we try to engage them. I mean, I know who has the most guns. It's math. I said I wasn't good at math, but that's an easy calculation. I know who has the guns, and I know who's willing to use them to kill a lot of people. So that doesn't mean that we can't defend ourselves. The thing you mentioned about Malcolm, everybody wants to act like Malcolm, like King was nonviolent, Malcolm was violent. Malcolm never did anything violent.
Right.
All he said was, if you hit me, you don't know what might be coming, right? And we are going to reserve the right to hit back. But that statement was not violence, and he never actually did it. You didn't see people in the Nation of Islam going out and just attacking people.
No, you don't.
Right? If you watch the movie and it was a real scene, this actually happened when one of the Nation of Islam, Fruit of Islam members was beaten by a cop in New York. What'd they do? They all went to the hospital where he was sitting there, like, I don't know if he was on life support, but he was beat up really, really badly. And they all go to the hospital or they go to the police station after they go to the hospital, and they're standing outside the precinct and they're yelling, and Malcolm stands up, raises his hand, and they all just sort of turn and leave. There was no violence. They didn't attack the precinct, but they got their message across, right? So that level of like forbearance and force is perfectly fine. That's part of the tradition of black protest. But all the people that we think of as being violent, they weren't being violent. When the Panthers picked up guns, they were just like, y'all said we could have guns. Y'all said everybody can have guns. Mm-hmm. This is y'all's thing. Y'all put it in. We didn't write the Second Amendment. You know, y'all wrote the Second Amendment, and now that we got guns, you don't want us to have guns. You know, we just got them just in case you mess with us. It wasn't like the Panthers were going into white neighborhoods like, you know, that wasn't what was happening. It was just, we are going to defend ourselves. That is, I think, perfectly acceptable. But the actual engaging in sabotage or the engaging in just acts of what could be called violence is usually more performative than it is revolutionary. And I think we need to have an understanding of that. And I think sometimes we don't.
Well, thank you so much, Brother Tim. What an honor. And thank you to the community who is also joining us online. I'll leave us with this. As we embrace in what is beloved Dr. King's vision of building a beloved community, it talks about building the increased levels of trust and avoiding fear that we must have within one another. It acknowledges the limitations that each of us have and the lack thereof, and the understanding to seek, to learn, to grow with one another. It acknowledges, Tim, that we're going to have pain. We're going to have conflict, and we're going to have to work through those difficulties. But it also talks about the importance of speaking truth in love, always considering what we know to be a compassionate way of meeting one another where we are. It recognizes and honors our shared humanity in order to center those people and places who we need to have the conversation with the greatest needs. It strives for those equitable outcomes, but understanding that we have a shared responsibility, as we heard earlier today, It is our responsibility to hold one another accountable, but we all have to do the work to get the work done. It promotes the well-being of all of the people. It also practices what is servant leadership. We understand that we have to be mindful to listen to one another. Don't be quick to speak. Make sure you listen. And it also remembers that we are on this journey together, and we are lifelong learners as educators too as well. So at this time, we thank you. It's been a privilege and an honor to hear from you. Community, let's show some love online and in person. Wonderful.